I can edit anything we're saying now, but we're in Matthew 25. The parable of the 10 virgins. It's simple. It is almost repetitive as far as the lesson that Jesus was trying to teach people on that last week. It was the main thrust of Jesus' teaching about either the end of the Jewish system with the destruction of Jerusalem or the end of time as we know it. What was the thing he just keeps telling them? Be prepared. You don't know when. And again, that's the same story he's telling here, just has a different set of characters, but the same point. So we won't belabor the point a whole lot, but I went through and came up with 10 things about the 10 virgins. So that's what we'll look at very quickly. Chapter 25, verse 1. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. So the very first sentence asks the question, what time? Right? At that time. You remember what we've been talking about in chapter 24. What time are we talking about? It's the big end of something, right? Look at 24:1. Now let's just go down to 3. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So they had been in the temple, and the disciples were all excited about how cool the temple was. And Jesus says, well, it's going to be torn completely down. And they said, when's that going to happen? And Jesus begins to unfold for them what he wanted them to know anyway, about that time frame. Then he gets to the end of 24, and he may or may not be talking about the end of the world as we know it. But we start 25 with, at that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins. So we're still in the same time frame. Either we're talking about the end of the Old Testament period, the destruction of Jerusalem, or we're talking about the end of time as we know it. The second question I thought was interesting. Why the number 10? And I'm glad David walked in when he did, because David has done some studying on this and some thinking about this. When we talk about the 1,000-year reign, right, that's 10 times 100. So what's the 1,000-year reign? Dave, what did you come up with as far as what the 1,000 might represent?
Just a perfect amount of time. Not an actual 1,000 years, but that's just like the 1,000 hills or whatever, all the cattle over 1,000 hills. He means everything, but the 1,000-year reign would be a perfect amount of time whenever God's done.
There you go. Whenever God's done, it's that perfect, complete amount of time. It's similar to the number 7 in that regard. It's kind of a perfect, complete number. And when you look at tens in the scriptures, the number itself shows up 242 times. The designation tenth shows up 79 times. It's viewed as a complete and perfect numeral like 3, 7, and 12. Didn't mention 12. It's always the 12. No, it's not. We finally figured that out. But 12, we know who we're talking about when we say 12. 12 tribes, 12 apostles. So in Genesis, the phrase God said shows up 10 times. I was unaware of that until I was looking at this stuff. He gave how many commandments? 10 commandments. So there are lots and lots of other commandments that God gave in the Old Testament. But when we think about God's commandments, we always think 10. It's the capsulation. It's the completeness of God's law. When you get to the day of Passover, you set the Passover lamb aside on the 10th day of the year. It's the 10th day of the first month. It's when you set the Passover lamb aside. Day 10 of the 7th month is the holy day known as the Day of Atonement. So tens are all over the place in Scripture. Lots and lots of tens. Now, whether Jesus had in mind anything like that when he said the 10 virgins, I don't know. But it fits, right? It's a completeness of people that are involved in waiting for the second coming of Christ or waiting for the end of the age. And they're waiting to meet the bridegroom, says verse 1. And in waiting to meet the bridegroom, who is the bridegroom? Well, his identity is he's the one that's coming on that day. Right? He doesn't come right out and say, hey, look, I'm the bridegroom. He doesn't give the interpretation to the disciples to say, look, when I say bridegroom, I'm talking about me. But as Christians, you read the writings of Paul, and Paul's pretty specific about the fact that we're betrothed to Jesus, that we're waiting on his return so that he'll take us to be with him where he is. Same thing is true about John 14. He's talking to his disciples, and he says, don't let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many dwelling places, and if it wasn't so, I would have told you. And I'm going to prepare a place for you. And then I'll come again and get you and receive you unto myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. And where I'm going, you know, and the way you know. That starts a whole nother conversation in John 14. So, number 4, this is, we need a general knowledge about first century weddings. When Becky and I got together, we met in October. We basically dated in November and part of November, and we got engaged in early December. She went home with me for Christmas. We came back from Christmas. On our way back to Harding, we stopped at the J.C. Penney's and bought rings. I called one of my good friends who was already certified as a preacher and said, will you marry us tonight? And he said, sure, come on, I'll meet you on campus. And so we eloped. We were together 3 months before we got married. Disclaimer, not everybody's as perfect as we are. But we've been together 40 years. That's not the way that it worked in the first century. The fathers would cut a deal. They would get together, and it was a business arrangement. So when the fathers got together, sometimes they used an intermediary. Sometimes the fathers would talk to each other independently. But the bottom line was they were cutting a deal. The family that needed a wife, mother, mate for their son was out shopping, and they would try to buy the rights to this young woman. Most of the girls that got married in those days were married before their 16th birthday. Right? So 16 was an old maid. We still had some of that early in this country. Again, Becky's grandmother on the marriage certificate, I think it said she was 16. By the time they did the math, we think maybe she was 15 or late 14 in a bunch. So there was a sense in which to be married was the norm. It was the thing you were looking forward to, but you didn't go out and fall in love and pick somebody. The daddies got together and did that. The groom's family would pay a bride's price because the mother and daddy of the bride were losing part of their workforce. Right? You weren't going to have that daughter to do whatever it was she did. She's leaving your family and becoming a part of that other family. So they're going to have to give us something to, offset the loss of this woman. And you usually think about in biblical times that women just weren't worth that much or whatever, but they were a great bargaining chip. If you had a daughter and somebody wanted to purchase your daughter or bring your daughter into their family, and they were willing to pay you. So you pay the bride's price and you sign the paperwork a year before you get married. So when Mary and Joseph were betrothed, it was as if they were already married. I think the King James is very specific. I think the NIV is close enough. Look over at Matthew 1. Matthew 1 and verse 18. This is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. Because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law, and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. You notice that word, divorce? They had a contract. it was as if they were already married, but she would continue to live with her family of birth until the final consummation, and the marriage was less of a take vows, make a contract kind of thing as it is now, and it was more of that idea of, okay, we're finishing out the contract, we're going to consummate the contract and bring her back. Well, during that year, the groom would prepare a bridal chamber. His job was to get the place ready so that when they got married, he'd have a place to bring her. When you elope, sometimes that's not the case. My father-in-law had a little cabin out in the woods about 18 miles from Searcy, and I went to him and I said, what does it profit a man if he has a cabin in the woods and no young couple to live therein? Or what will a man give in exchange for an elopement? He says, I'll get you the key. So we moved out there and lived there for the first 3 months that we were married. But these guys in the Mosaic Law, they would make a room. They would build a little antechamber on the back of mom and dad's house because it was always an extended family situation. So as the family grew, then the wives would come in, but the sons didn't necessarily go out. Otherwise, you lost your workforce. You lost your money-making potential. If you lost all your sons, if they moved somewhere else, then you had problems. So all of this is taking place prior to the night that all the virgins are gathered together waiting on the bridegroom. So they've somewhat prepared themselves for the coming of the bridegroom. We find out in the parable that some of them were less prepared than others. Number 5, all the virgins were together. They were in the same place. That might be telling. When Jesus is talking about the number 10, the completeness, and all of them are in the same place. They're waiting in the same place for the same thing. So if we're talking about the Jewish nation, all of the Jews in Jesus' day were waiting on the same thing. What were they waiting for? They're waiting on Messiah, right? So Messiah comes, some of them are prepared, some of them are not. So it fits well that may be what he's talking about. If he's talking about some kind of coming in judgment in 70 AD, it would still fit. Some of them were ready, some of them were not, some of them were prepared, some of them were not. And then if he's talking about the end of time, we've preached it that way for years and years, and it's easy to apply that. Some people who are waiting for Jesus' return and will tell you, I'm waiting for Jesus to come back. I think there's going to be a second coming. I believe that God's going to send Jesus to get us, but they're not prepared. They're not getting ready for that event, and some people are. So it fits just about any way you want to plug it in. But anyway, all the virgins were together. They were in the same place. When the bridegroom comes, all of the virgins are asleep. I always think about the 5 being asleep, but we'll read it here in a minute. All 10 were asleep. All of the virgins, when they wake up, are low on oil. That's the problem. There are some that are low and have made no provisions. They're too low. They're not going to be able to finish the evening with what they have. There are others who are low, but they've got enough to finish the evening, but only enough to finish the evening. That's going to be their answer. Right? We can't help you, or we'll be in the same predicament that you're in. So we can't give you our oil. Otherwise, we'll run out as well. There's no accommodations made for the poorly prepared. The ones who run out of oil, they ask, can we have some of your oil? And nobody will help them. When they get to the feast, they're not allowed in. Right? There's no feeling of sympathy for them. There's no, maybe we could fix this. It's just a very cut and dried exclusion for all these 5 women who were waiting, who were with their lamps, who were asleep. You know, they were part of that 10 who were all doing the same thing, but their lack was they didn't bring enough oil to be prepared for the final event. If you think about it a minute, you have to know that they lived probably in a small town. There weren't any great big cities. There was, I guess, Lachish, and Bethel wasn't too small. Shechem, Jerusalem. There were some fairly large-sized cities, but not like we would think, a large city would be. It was small enough that on the night of the consummation, the groom would get all of his friends, and they would light their lights, and they would walk through town and go to the house of the bride and get the bride and all of her friends, and then they would walk back. And along the way, people would join the procession. So they liked to do it just a little after sundown, and everybody would get together, and there would be these great torches shining and people laughing and excited, and they would walk them all the way home, and they would go in and they would stay there probably as much as a week, sometimes 2 weeks, that they would just stay at this wedding feast. Remember Jesus getting called on to make wine because the wedding feast at Cana had gone on a little while and they were running out of wine, and Mary was afraid the family would be embarrassed. So, Jesus do something about it. Jesus makes enough wine that they could have gone on for another couple of weeks. Plenty of wine. So the bridegroom gets his bunch together and they make the walk. And as they're coming back to his house, people are joining them all along the way. And the 5 who are prepared join them along the way. The 5 who are not prepared have to go somewhere to buy oil. We find out that they are able to buy oil. What time is it? Midnight, right? The groom comes at midnight. He should have come right after sunset. Why does he come at midnight? Because he always comes at midnight, right? The Messiah is never going to come when you're looking for him. And this idea of sometimes we're talking about thieves, right? The thieves are not going to call you and tell you that they're coming to rob your house. You've got to be prepared. Jesus says the bridegroom comes at midnight. Nobody should be up waiting on the bridegroom at midnight. But on the other hand, everybody should be up waiting on the bridegroom at midnight. So anyway, he comes at midnight. But they're able to find oil. They buy oil at midnight in this little town. So they've got connections. They know where to go. They get the oil for their lamps. And then it kind of ends like it begins. At that time, the kingdom of heaven is like 10 virgins. And then when you get to the verse 13, we'll read it here in a minute. Therefore keep watch, because you don't know the day or the hour. So it kind of ends as it begins. And I want us to read the parable and then go over and read a couple of other passages in Matthew 24 to kind of remind us. All right, at that time, meaning some huge event in the future, perhaps the fall of Jerusalem, perhaps the end of time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps, but did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight, the cry rang out, "Here comes the bridegroom, come out and meet him." Then all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, our lamps are going out." "No," they replied, "there may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." But while they were on their way to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later the others also came. "Lord, Lord," they said, "open the door for us." But he replied, "Truly I tell you, I don't know you. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour." So it's a really sad parable. I think about a cluster of 15-year-old girls who are attending the wedding probably of somebody about their age. It would have been an exciting time. They would have been wanting to be a part of it, but they did a poor job of preparing for it. They didn't get ready. When it was time to go, their other friends who were probably close to their age are also getting ready and getting things set to go, and they're not going to share with them. They're willing to let them miss out on the opportunity rather than sharing any possibly leftover oil that they've got. And then they finally get there, and the master of the feast opens the door and says, I don't have a clue who you are. Won't even let them in. I'm pretty positive that if you lived in one of those little towns, they knew who these girls were. Why did they tell them no? Let's start with the other virgins. Why did the other virgins not share? Was it really about fear that they would run out?
Right, they might run out of oil.
Yeah, they're not taking any chances. They are so convinced that their light must be lit to be part of the procession and be part of the thing. They're not giving in. They're not going to endanger that in any way. So we might get a lesson out of that sometimes we have to guard our relationship with the Lord, even if it's a problem with our relationship with other people. That might be what Jesus was getting at, but they're not going to share. The girls go and get their oil, and they make it to the wedding, and they're told, we don't know who you are. You're not on the guest list. Why would they turn them away?